The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just a single sheet of paper, but the weight of my past, my dignity, and everything I once believed in. Christmas Eve in the snowy quiet of Aspen had always been a time of warmth and light, but that year, the twinkling tree and soft carols only made the chill inside the room sharper. As I broke the seal, I already knew what it would say. My father's cold, unreadable stare had told me more than words ever could. "You're not getting anything," he said as casually as announcing the weather, while my sister Natalie chimed in with a syrupy voice. "You haven't opened it yet?" I read the words in silence, and by the time I reached the end, something in me cracked. They'd done it. They had actually cut me out of the will, right there under the glow of the Christmas lights, because I chose a bakery over the family law firm. I folded the paper with steady hands as the firelight flickered across its surface like it was mocking me, but I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that made the room fall still, because what they didn't realize was that while they were busy writing me out of their story, I was already crafting the first chapter of my own, one that would turn the tables in a way they'd never see coming. I stood there, holding the letter that declared, in no uncertain terms, I was no longer part of the legacy I was born into. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was a verdict, and I'd already been judged guilty. My mother, Elaine, always more invested in her bridge club's opinions than her own children, didn't bother to meet my eyes. She swirled the red wine in her glass as if nothing unusual had just occurred, as if disowning your eldest child was standard Christmas tradition. "It's for the best, sweetie," she said casually, as though discussing the weather. "You've chosen your path and we've chosen ours." I wanted to believe I'd misunderstood, that perhaps there was some clause I'd overlooked or a cruel joke being played. But the attorney they'd hired, Mr. Dawson, a man whose holiday cheer had clearly died years ago, simply shifted in his chair and avoided eye contact. His presence there on Christmas Eve said more than words ever could. "What choices?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady for someone who'd just been cut loose by her own blood. "You mean the bakery? The business I built from nothing because I didn't want to waste my life pushing papers at the firm like everyone else in this family?" My father, Richard, leaned forward, the weight of his disappointment settling into every word. "We invested in your education, in your future, and you decided to throw it all away on pastries." "They're not just pastries," I replied, though the conviction in my voice was beginning to crumble under the heat of their disdain. "It's what I love. It's mine." He waved me off with the same dismissive gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before, when I didn't want to join the firm, when I declined to date the son of his business partner, when I dared to think differently. "Dreams don't pay bills, Charlotte," he snapped. "Natalie understands responsibility. She's already helping with the upcoming expansion." And there she was, my sister, smirking from Mom's favourite leather chair, the diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the glow from the fireplace. Her smile wasn't warm. It was victorious. "You had to know this was coming," she said, feigning sympathy while twisting the knife just a little deeper. "Come on, Shah, don't be dramatic. You chose cupcakes over contracts." For a moment I didn't respond. I could still hear the music playing faintly from the neighbours' houses, the notes of joy and warmth drifting through the window like ghosts of a life I thought I had. I folded the letter with deliberate care, as if handling something fragile, something once sacred. The lights on the tree reflected off the glossy paper like mocking stars. What struck me most wasn't the betrayal itself. I had suspected for a long time that I was an outsider in my own family. It was the ease with which they did it. The cold efficiency, the complete absence of guilt or hesitation, the way they had already moved on with their holiday celebration while mine had just shattered. "I guess I expected more," I said, smoothing the creases in my dress while every breath scraped against the lump forming in my throat. Silly me. The room fell uncomfortably silent save for the popping embers in the fireplace. Mr. Dawson began to gather his things, mumbling something about not wanting to intrude further. but no one stopped him. Just like no one stopped me as I walked to the coat rack and slid into my wool jacket, one I suddenly realized I might never wear in this house again. "Where are you going?" my father asked, his tone sharp, indignant that I would dare leave the table before the roast was served. "I've lost my appetite," I replied simply. My hand reached for the door, but I paused. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I knew I had to say it. "You all think you're punishing me, cutting me out, pushing me away. But what you don't realize is that the punishment may not be mine. It might just be yours." Natalie stood then, her expression briefly faltering. "What is that supposed to mean?" I turned, looked her square in the eye and said with a calm I didn't yet feel, "Merry Christmas and good luck. You're going to need it." The door closed behind me with a satisfying finality, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Snow had started to fall, coating the street in silence, wrapping the night in a soft white hush. I pulled out my phone and dialed the one person who had stood by me when no one else did. "Natasha," I said when she picked up. "It happened. Just like we thought it would." Her voice crackled with restrained fury. "Are you okay?" I paused, watching the house grow smaller in my rearview mirror. "Actually, I'm better than okay. You remember that conversation we had? The backup plan?" "Yeah? I think it's time." And with that, I turned toward downtown, toward the next chapter of my life, one not built on handouts or expectations, but on something far more powerful, the quiet, steady resolve of a woman who had been betrayed by her own family and was now ready to rise from it. 3 months before that bitter Christmas Eve, I found myself standing in front of an old lakeside cottage just outside Maple Hollow, the kind of place families once went to escape the noise of everyday life, a place that had been forgotten, much like me. The house had belonged to my parents, or rather it had been in my father's name until he transferred it to mine 5 years earlier for some tax shelter scheme he barely explained and never followed up on. I don't think he even remembered doing it. The siding was weathered and chipped, the shutters hung slightly crooked, and the mailbox still bore the faded crest of our family name, Harland, in gold paint that had long since lost its shine. Beside me, Natasha whistled low as she stepped onto the porch and ran her hand along the railing. "They really just forgot they gave you an entire house?" I nodded, unlocking the door with a key I'd nearly thrown away twice. "Dad didn't care about details unless they benefited him directly," I said. "And when he made me the legal owner, it was because he assumed I'd always do what I was told." Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of dust and old pine, the kind of stillness that settles over a place abandoned by time and memory. Nautical trinkets lined the mantel, and a faded photo of our family at the lake, back when smiles were still real and my father held my hand like he meant it, sat in a tarnished frame near the fireplace. I looked away. "How much do you think it's worth?" Natasha asked, pulling back the curtains to reveal the expansive view of Blueberry Lake glittering in the winter sun. I pulled out my phone and showed her the appraisal. Her eyes widened. "That's more than enough to start the bakery. Like, way more." "It's everything," I whispered, running my hand over the dusty countertop where my mother used to lay out sandwiches during summer picnics. "The down payment, the equipment, first year's lease. It's all here, hidden in plain sight." Natasha turned to me, her eyes burning with something between pride and disbelief. "So, what's the plan? I mean the real plan?" I grinned, something unfamiliar flickering in my chest, a spark I hadn't felt in years. "I sell the house, quietly. Then I open the Wildflower and Wheat Bakery right in the heart of downtown, 2 blocks from the Harland Law Group's headquarters. They won't see it coming." She laughed, a full, throaty sound that echoed through the empty living room. "Oh, girl, you are so not playing checkers." "They always underestimated me," I said, settling onto the old couch as a puff of dust rose around us like ghosts. "And that's their biggest mistake." Over the next few weeks, everything moved faster than I'd anticipated. Real estate agents were eager. Apparently, lakefront property, even one in need of updating, was still gold. Paperwork flew between inboxes and conference calls. I learned the ins and outs of escrow, property tax transfers, and utility settlements, all while refining recipes late into the night and sketching designs for my dream cafe on crumpled napkins and takeout bags. By the time I met with Brett, an old friend from college who now worked in commercial finance, I had a full business plan, a name, and a vision. Over coffee, I laid it all out for him, the spreadsheet projections nestled between samples of my lavender honey scones and cranberry orange muffins. He took a bite, paused, then looked up at me with a rare kind of seriousness. "Charlotte," he said slowly, "I don't say this lightly, but this is good. Like Food and Wine magazine good." "That's not even my best recipe," I smiled, sliding a sketch of the storefront toward him. "I found the perfect spot, corner of Main and Hollis, high-foot traffic, reasonable rent, and guess what's visible through the front windows?" He raised a brow. "The law firm?" I nodded. "Their boardroom." Brett leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "Poetic." "It's not revenge," I said quietly, though even I didn't fully believe it. "It's reclaiming something they tried to take from me." He didn't argue, but the smirk on his face said it all. When I signed the lease, Natasha brought champagne in paper cups, and we toasted right there on the floor of the empty storefront. As the sun dipped behind the skyline of Maple Hollow, casting long shadows over the cracked tile and dusty counters, she raised her cup and said, "To your bakery, your freedom, and whatever beautifully ironic ending karma has planned for the Harlands." I laughed, but there was a lump in my throat I couldn't quite swallow. "To beginnings," I said instead, "especially the kind you bake from scratch." The contractors started work the next morning, gutting the interior and laying the foundation for my new life. Each brick, each bolt, each chosen fixture a rejection of the life I'd left behind. I handpicked the light fixtures, warm copper domes that gave off a golden glow, and commissioned hand-carved display cases that would showcase the pastries I'd once made, alone in a cramped apartment kitchen. My oven, my rules, my dream, finally taking form. And just like that, the Wildflower and Wheat Cafe was no longer an idea. It was real. 3 months later, we had a line down the block, wedding cake consultations booked 2 months in advance, and a mention in the local food blog that got reposted by regional press. Every morning, I arrived early to prep the dough, brew the coffee, and set out the day's specials. And every evening, as the lights across the street flickered on inside the Harland offices, I stood at my window, flour on my apron, and peace in my chest. They had no idea that while they were busy orchestrating my erasure, I was quietly building an empire, one cupcake at a time. And I wasn't even done yet. The morning we installed the gilded sign over the front entrance, Wildflower and Wheat Bakery and Cafe, was the moment it all felt undeniably real. I stood across the street, fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of cinnamon latte, watching the sunlight catch each gold letter like it had been waiting for years to reflect my name. That sign wasn't just branding, it was a declaration. One that stood only 2 blocks away from the Harland Law Group's polished tower of glass and pretense. Inside, the smell of fresh bread and roasted beans filled the air, blending with the quiet buzz of sanding tools and soft jazz. Contractors moved around me, mounting fixtures, wiring custom lighting, and assembling the final piece of a vision that had once lived only in my imagination and late-night sketches. Every choice I made, every tile, every table, every beam of soft light was a brick in the wall between who I used to be and the woman I had become. Business came quickly, faster than I could have hoped. Within weeks of opening, we were filling orders faster than our ovens could keep up. My cranberry walnut scones became a morning staple for commuters. My lemon lavender tart made it onto a regional food blogger's top 10 must-try treats. Couples were booking wedding cake tastings a month in advance, and our weekends turned into standing-room-only brunch hours. And just like that, the Wildflower wasn't a hidden gem anymore. It was the pulse of downtown. But the sweetest flavour came not from the pastries, but from the subtle yet undeniable shift in the air. Brett, who had taken to swinging by every morning under the guise of market updates, delivered news I pretended not to be eager for. "They've laid off another junior partner," he told me one Thursday morning, unwrapping a pumpkin spice muffin as if discussing the weather. "Word is, they're hemorrhaging clients. And credit? Let's just say the banks aren't returning their calls." I didn't flinch. I merely slid a tray of chocolate ganache cupcakes into the display case and said, "Funny how things come full circle." Later that day, a message appeared on my phone. Natalie, again. "Mum and Dad are worried. They say you're ignoring their calls." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying with 2 words. "Been busy." The next text came minutes later, thick with sarcasm. "Let me guess. Making cupcakes?" I didn't reply. That same evening, while I was supervising the installation of new espresso equipment, the door swung open and in walked Natasha, phone in hand, eyes wide. "You are not going to believe this," she said, barely containing her glee. "The Gazette just published their annual Best of Maple Hollow list. Guess who took the top spot in the food category?" I already knew, but the satisfaction didn't dull. The Wildflower had just outpaced the city's top-rated bistro, and the cafe's name now sat printed in bold across every newsstand in town. That weekend, I made my first serious investment. A commercial real estate opportunity opened on 3rd Street, prime downtown property that my father's firm had been quietly eyeing for their expansion. I beat them to it, sealing the deal before they even submitted their bid. When I received a flurry of missed calls from Natalie and a vague, passive-aggressive email from my mother asking if I had any knowledge of certain building permits being misfiled, I replied with a single sentence. "I believe in acting early. You taught me that." Weeks passed. My staff grew. So did our lines. Brett delivered news like little trophies. They've let go of their marketing team. They missed payroll. The bank just foreclosed on one of their rental properties. Still, I never gloated. Not out loud. I didn't need to. Every order we filled, every pastry we plated, every new lease I signed was its own quiet victory. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, as the golden light spilled through the front windows, my mother walked into the Wildflower. She stood awkwardly near the entrance, her eyes scanning the busy cafe, lingering on the details: copper lights, white marble counters, pressed flowers beneath glass tabletops. Everything she once told me was frivolous, and doomed was now a living, thriving testament to the dream she had dismissed. "Charlotte," she said, her voice unsure, "this wasn't what we expected." I smiled, wiping flour from my hands as I stepped out from behind the counter. "Well, I've never been much for expectations." She hesitated before speaking again. "Your father and we need to speak with you. It's about the firm." I crossed my arms gently, tilting my head. The firm that disowned me on Christmas Eve? The one I was told I'd never understand? "Yes," she whispered. "That one." I could have laughed, could have turned away and sent her back to the cold hallway from which she came, but something inside me, maybe maturity, maybe pride, chose differently. "I have a 15-minute break at 5, I said. "We can talk then. At my office." Her eyes flicked toward the corner where my name was etched in gold on the glass of the side door: Charlotte Harland, owner. She gave a small, strained nod and left without another word. That evening, when 5 o'clock came, my parents returned, shoulders heavier, faces older, pride in tatters. I greeted them with lavender shortbread and Earl Grey, served on the vintage china my mother once said was too sentimental for daily use. And when they began to speak, haltingly, reluctantly, about partnerships, debt relief, and investment shares, I simply listened. I didn't rush. I let them sit with the silence their years of dismissal had built. When my father offered me a folder containing a partnership agreement, equal voting rights, full name inclusion, the works, I took it with careful hands. I opened it, scanned the familiar legal jargon, and then, without raising my voice or breaking eye contact, I tore it clean down the middle. They gasped, but I didn't shout. I didn't need to. "I'm not here to rescue the empire that buried me," I said. "I'm here to grow what you all tried to kill." They sat in stunned silence, and I let them. Because sometimes the most powerful sound is not a scream, but the quiet, certain voice of someone who finally knows her worth. By the time my parents walked through the door of the Wildflower that evening, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow across the hardwood floors and hand-painted walls. I had closed early, not for them, but because I wanted no distractions. My staff had gone home except for Natasha, who pretended to wipe down tables with the kind of exaggerated casualness that made it clear she intended to catch every word. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, gesturing to the antique teapot and matching cups I had set out. Earl Grey, my mother's favourite, steeped just the way she liked it. "This isn't a social visit," my father said gruffly, but she touched his arm and answered instead. "Tea would be lovely." She took her seat at the copper-backed chair across from me, her gaze drifting over the elegant wall of framed articles, customer reviews, and press clippings that chronicled my journey from irrelevant disappointment to one of the city's most talked-about entrepreneurs. For a moment, I almost saw admiration in her eyes, but it passed too quickly to be trusted. Once everyone had settled, my father cleared his throat and, in his familiar legal tone, began, "We're here to discuss a business proposition." I raised an eyebrow but kept my voice steady. "A bakery doesn't count as a business, remember? That's what you said." He hesitated, then pressed on. "Things have changed. The firm is facing temporary setbacks, staff cuts, client departures, delays with the expansion." "Delays?" I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "That's one word for bankruptcy." My mother stiffened, but my father simply frowned. "We need a partner, someone with capital, someone with credibility." I let the silence stretch for several seconds longer than was comfortable, letting them sit in the discomfort they'd earned, then said evenly, "You want me to bail you out." "Not bail out," my mother interjected quickly. "Collaborate. We're offering equal partnership, voting rights, your name on the door next to Natalie's." I took the folder they slid across the table and glanced through the pages, numbers, shares, titles, all of it wrapped in corporate language that reeked of desperation. Then, without a word, I tore it cleanly in half and set the two pieces down between us. My mother gasped softly, and my father's jaw clenched, his pride wounded far more than his business acumen. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "Oh, I'm deadly serious," I said, folding my hands in front of me. "You came here hoping I'd be so flattered by your generous offer that I'd forget everything you did to get me out of your way." "We were wrong," my mother said, her voice barely audible. "About you, about all of it." "No," I corrected her. "You weren't wrong. You just never bothered to see past what you wanted me to be." I stood slowly and walked over to the display wall behind the counter, the bakery's milestones laid out like a timeline of resilience. I tapped the frame that held our first 5-star review. "This is my legacy," I said. "Not the Harland name, not the firm, this." "You're punishing us," my father accused. "You're enjoying this." I turned, my voice calm but firm. "What I'm doing is reclaiming what you tried to erase. And no, I'm not enjoying your failure, but I'm finally at peace with not saving you from it." "But we're your family," my mother said, and I heard the break in her voice, real, raw, unguarded. "You stopped being that when you handed me a legal disinheritance instead of a Christmas card," I replied, feeling the truth in every syllable. "You told me I didn't belong. And now you're sitting in my office asking for a seat at my table." Across the room, Natasha let out a slow, almost imperceptible breath, as if trying not to disrupt the fragile air between us. "What do you want?" my father asked, frustration colouring his tone. "Name your price." I walked back to the table and looked at them both. This isn't about money. It never was. It's about respect, about recognition, about the fact that for years, I wasn't your daughter. I was your liability. We see that now, my mother said, reaching for my hand, but I pulled back gently. Seeing it now doesn't undo the years you didn't, I replied. You're here because Natalie couldn't pull you out of the fire, and your backup plan ended up building something you never thought possible. You're not here for me. You're here for what I've created. My father's lips pressed into a tight line. We're not asking for charity. No, I said, stepping back toward the counter. You're asking for redemption. And that's something you'll have to earn. They stood then, both of them looking smaller than I remembered. Less like parents, more like people who had been chasing their own reflection for too long. At the door, my mother turned. What about family? She asked quietly. Doesn't that still mean something to you? I paused, my back still to them, then turned slowly and answered. It meant everything to me, until the night you made it clear it meant nothing to you. They left, without another word, the door's chime a final note in a conversation that had taken me years to be ready for. Natasha emerged from behind the counter, shaking her head. That, she said, was a masterclass in dignity. It's not over, I replied, wiping the last teacup and returning it to the shelf. They'll be back, maybe not for business, maybe just to understand. And if they don't, she asked, then they'll keep falling, I said, not with bitterness, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had learned that closure isn't always about reconciliation. Either way, I'm not their lifeline. And just as I said it, my phone buzzed, Natalie's name flashing across the screen once more. How dare you turn them down? They were trying to make peace. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Number they were trying to survive. There's a difference. The next evening, I arrived at my childhood home just before 7. The Harland estate, once a symbol of affluence and rigidity, now looked weathered and smaller than I remembered, as though the facade itself had begun to collapse under the weight of its own perfection. Natalie greeted me at the door, still in her office slacks, her makeup smudged and her posture tight. She didn't say hello, she just stepped aside to let me in. They're in the dining room, she muttered, already walking away. Try not to make it worse. I passed through the long, echoing hallway lined with portraits of ancestors none of us ever really knew, and I entered a space that once commanded obedience. Dark wood, silver flatware, candles always lit even when no one was there to see them. My mother and father sat at opposite ends of the long table, the silence between them deeper than any wound they'd left on me. You came, my mother said, her voice thin. I'm curious by nature, I replied, taking the seat that had once been mine but now felt unfamiliar, even foreign. So what is this about? My father cleared his throat, his eyes focused on a fixed point on the wall behind me. We've lost everything. The house is on the market. The cars, the rentals, the expansion properties, gone. You mean the house you forgot was legally mine funded your daughter's bakery and your downfall? I said, not unkindly, but without apology. My mother winced. We deserved that. But, Charlotte, we're still your parents. We're still family. I studied them in silence, noting the way their pride had dissolved not just from their voices, but from their posture, their appearance, even the way they looked at me now. Not as a daughter they hoped to control, but as a person they couldn't afford to lose. Family, I repeated softly. You handed me a disinheritance letter on Christmas Eve and didn't blink. We were wrong, my father said, and for the first time the words sounded like they cost him something. The firm, my mother added, was never more important than you. We just couldn't see past our own legacy. And now that legacy is dust, I said, pushing away my untouched plate. So, let me ask you something. What do you want from me now? Money? Reputation? A bridge back to relevance? No, my mother whispered, her eyes glassy. We want forgiveness. A chance. A way to make this right. I stood walking over to the tall windows that overlooked the garden where I used to play before I was told I was too old for imagination. The hedges were overgrown, the roses gone wild, and the fountain had long since stopped running. It looked more honest now than it ever had before. You want forgiveness, I said finally, but you're still trying to earn it with explanations instead of actions. You want me to believe you've changed, but I've spent years becoming the person I am now without any of your help. So here's what I'll give you. A start. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small white box tied with twine and handed it to my mother. What is this? She asked, startled. A new recipe, I said. I call it Humble Beginnings. Dark chocolate, a hint of bitterness, and a touch of gold, because even the hardest stories deserve a beautiful ending. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. Is this a joke? No, I replied. It's a reminder that sometimes you have to lose everything to appreciate what you once took for granted. As I turned to leave, my father's voice stopped me. Will we ever see you again? I paused, one hand on the doorway. The wildflowers open Tuesday through Sunday, I said, without turning back. 9 to 6. You know where to find me. The next morning, as I was prepping dough before sunrise, I found Natalie standing outside the bakery, arms crossed, hair undone, a kind of rawness in her face that told me she hadn't slept much. She followed me inside without a word. I want to work here, she said, setting her handbag on the counter. I nearly dropped the measuring cup in my hand. Excuse me? You heard me, she said, her voice tight. Dishwashing, sweeping floors, whatever you need. I need to start over and I want to understand, not just how you did this, but why I never did. I studied her carefully, looking for the usual signs of manipulation, but they weren't there. Just fatigue, desperation, and maybe, just maybe, something real. You've never worked a day of service in your life, I said. I know, she nodded. That's why I'm asking. I tossed her an apron. Start with table wipe-downs. Don't skip corners. Over the next few days, I watched her quietly, noticing how her polished nails cracked, how her once aloof manner softened, how she began to greet customers by name and refill their coffee without being asked. She never complained, not even when she burned her hand on the espresso machine, or when her feet ached from standing 12 hours straight. On the third day, our mother walked in and froze when she saw Natalie wiping down tables in an apron. What are you doing? She asked, her voice caught between horror and disbelief. Working, Natalie replied, steady as ever. And table 6 needs more napkins. After a long pause, my mother looked at me. Is this punishment? No, I said, stacking trays behind the counter. It's her choice, probably the first real one she's ever made. I came to tell you, we sold the house. Your father is looking for work. What kind? I asked. Anything. No one's calling back. Reputation follows merit, I said quietly, and theirs is catching up. Later that day, I gave Natalie a small, quiet nod as she passed me with a tray. She didn't smile, but the way her shoulders lifted told me she felt it. A shift, an acknowledgement, a seed of something better. Weeks passed. My mother got hired as a floor assistant at a department store. My father finally took a dishwasher job at the new cafe across town, one of the buildings I now owned. He didn't know I had vouched for him, but I didn't need him to. 6 months after Natalie started, she came to me with trembling hands and said, "Am I ready for more?" And I told her, "You've earned it. The hard way. The right way." The following year, standing at the podium of the local business awards banquet, I looked out over the crowd and saw them there, my family, seated in the back, no longer towering figures of control, but quiet observers of a journey they had once tried to derail. I didn't speak to impress them. I spoke to honor every step it took to reclaim my name. Success, I told the audience, isn't inherited. It's baked from scratch, with patience, persistence, and, yes, sometimes pain. But the sweetest kind of success is the one you build in full view of those who told you you'd fail, so they can see, every single day, exactly what they missed. And as the applause rose around me, I looked down at the envelope I still carried in my pocket, the original letter that had cut me out of the will, and realized I no longer needed revenge to feel whole. I had something better. I had peace. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's had to rise from ashes. Subscribe to The Underdog's Revenge for more true-to-life stories of quiet strength, earned dignity, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Because sometimes the best comeback is becoming exactly who they said you never could be.